guys want to throw daggers at me for start having this meeting on a Friday, and I know we have so many other things going on today, so we are not planning on holding you long. But we did want to start the discussion a little more intimately regarding the House Bill 581. I know our tax commissioner and our tax assessor has presented some information previously at one of our commission meetings, and therefore we're going to talk about it a little more because that was prior to it actually being voted on and approved. So we're going to tag team a little bit today. I'm going to start out with the introduction and what we're doing in the presentation. Then we're going to have some of the financial impact discussed by Mr. Schreier from our finance department. And then we're going to also have Mr. Roundtree come up and talk a little bit about the procedural changes that would have to take place if we do decide to do anything as it relates to that. So I welcome everybody here this afternoon. I see we have our chamber members here. We also have our tax commissioner here, office here, so that they can address any questions anybody has. So with all of that, we will go ahead and get started. So just to give you a little background of where House Bill 581 started and where it came from, the legislature entered in the 2024 session concerned about our rising property values and assessments. So the Senate leaders wanted measures to control rapid increases in property assessments. House leaders looked to expand sales tax options, and so various proposals ultimately resulted in our House Bill 581 and also our HR 1022. So just to give you a brief overview of House Bill 581, it was signed into law April 18, 2024. It was contingent upon November statewide referendum, HR 1022, which of course passed statewide, 64.5% voted yes. And in Richmond County, we had 62% of our voters that supported this House bill. Now, the major components of this House bill is statewide floating homestead exemption, new local option sales tax, and property tax procedural changes, of all which we'll discuss during this presentation. So the presentation outline will entail what does this bill take, when does it take effect, what is the floating homestead exemption, what is the possible financial impact to Augusta, what is the procedure to opt out, and what is that timeline if we should decide to do so, what is the new sales tax, other property tax changes, policy considerations, and any questions that this local governing body has. When does this bill take effect? It actually takes effect January 1st, 2025. Again, January 1st, 2025. This statewide floating homestead exemption implements a statewide for all local governments, counties, cities, and school boards. A floating homestead is a special type of homestead exemption designed to offset or reduce increases in taxable value to the property. So this is not a new idea. Many jurisdictions across the state have already adopted similar homestead exemptions through traditional local act process. So how does a floating homestead exemption work? It works by increasing the value of the exemption to offset inflation. For example, property had a taxable value of $100,000 in year one. Taxable value increases to $110,000 in year two due to the market change. The exemption floats, and this is where the word floats come from, to be worth $10,000 of the taxable value. So the taxpayer still pays on the original year one value of $100,000. So that $10,000 is that floating value that they're talking about. So that's where the word floating comes from. How does House Bill 581's floating homestead exemption work? So base your year value is adjusted by rate of inflation determined by the State Revenue Commissioner, more likely the CPI. Again, an example, a property has $100,000 taxable value in year one and $110,000 in year two. But if the CPI is 2%, the base value of the $100,000 may be increased only up to that 2%. Exemption floats to be worth the $8,000. So that difference between that $110,000 and that $102,000, the difference of $8,000 would actually be a taxable value of $102,000 in year 2. So that $8,000 would be actually the float. How does House Bill 581 floating homestead exemption work? So for homes first receiving this exemption in taxable year 2025, the base year assessed value will be the 2024 assessed value. Similar to other homestead exemptions, the value will be reset when the home is sold and adjusted if there are substantial changes made to the respective property. Homeowners cannot transfer exemption to new property. How does the HB 581 floating homestead exemption work? The effect of HB 581 homestead exemption is the taxable value of a home may only increase at a rate of inflation each year. Essentially, controlling this will control how much the value of a home can increase annually. Homeowners already granted a homestead will receive this exemption automatically. So in 2024, approximately 31,000 properties in Richmond County. 31,000 properties is roughly 38% of all properties. Non-homestead property, i.e. our commercial properties, will continue to be valued at fair market. In 2024, approximately 49,000 properties in Richmond County, or 62% of all properties, are considered commercial. Homeowners with existing homestead exemptions, again, will not need to apply, but automatically will receive this homestead exemption. So how does it affect the existing homestead exemptions? This is on top. This floating homestead exemption is in addition to, and not in lieu of all non-floating homestead exemptions. This will not repeal or replace existing homestead exemptions. Existing local exemptions, such as the 2,000 of assessed value, are added after the floating homestead exemption is calculated. If there is an existing local floating homestead exemption, the taxpayer will receive whichever of the 2 exemptions is more beneficial to them. This is also true if a local floating homestead exemption is added in the future. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim Schreier now from our finance department so he can talk about how this will affect all of the respective properties.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, this floating homestead exemption for the nets for the organization for the county is relatively marginal. I'll show that on the next slide. However, the more affected is on the individual properties. As you can see, the homestead in the base here. Excuse me. The homestead has a base tax of $226,000, and in year 3 it goes up to $242,000. For the non-homestead, it's $258,000, which goes up to $344,000. In essence, what the House bill is doing is redistributing how the taxes are paid. This is just a graphical representation that the homestead property remains relatively flat, but the non-homestead property is going to have a sharper increase. The financial impact for Augusta, as I said, is going to be marginal. Or I'm sorry, this is how it's going to look for an individual house, homeowner. First column is the current. We have a $100,000 house. It goes up at $10,000 to the value. The assessed value is $110,000. Your tax is going to be $259,000. If the floating homestead exemption is placed in place, that taxable value or the assessed value is going to go down to $102,000, and your tax is $238,000. However, if you have a piece of property that's worth $110,000, just like your neighbor, and you've owned that property for a while, your taxable assessment is going to be higher than your neighbor's house. So you will be paying more taxes on the same property at the same assessed value. Again, the financial impact for Augusta is relatively digest is gonna go down a little bit, but because of the legislation, when the digest goes down, we're going to be able to increase our rollback rate. So that goes up a little bit, and that net effect is about $1,500. So overall, it's not going to affect the organization's net income. It's just going to affect who pays how much. Thank you.
So how can our local government opt out of this homestead exemption? Because you're automatically opted in. So if you decide to remain in, there's nothing else we need to do as a governing body. But if we do decide to opt out, the local government must advertise and conduct at least 3 meetings, public meetings, must file resolution to the Secretary of State by March 1st, 2025. And if the procedures are not met, opt-out will not be effective. How can the local government opt out? Again, this process may not begin until actually the bill takes place, which is January 1st. A governing authority may not opt out of the statewide floating homestead exemption after that deadline. However, the local delegation, and keep this in mind, may pass a local act of the General Assembly to implement a local floating homestead exemption at any time. So our local delegation can decide to pass a local act of the General Assembly to implement this local floating homestead exemption at any time. Important to note that the decision to opt out is independent among local governments. So Augusta and the Richmond County Board of Education may not decide to do the same thing. One may decide to opt out, the other may not. The decision of whether or not to opt out will not impact the other local government's homestead exemption. This may result in homes having different taxable values. Is the decision to opt out or stay in permanent? Yes. No action is needed again if you decide to continue and be opted in. But once the opt-out period has passed, currently, there is no future method to opt in or opt back out. A similar homestead exemption can still be done in a traditional manner. So let's look at the respective timeline. November 5th, 2024, statewide question on constitutional amendment was done. January 1st, of course, HB 581 will take effect. And March 1st, 2025, the deadline for local governments to opt out of the homestead exemption. HB 581 sales tax revisions and flexible local option sales tax. So House Bill 581 makes 2 major changes to our local sales tax. It revises the OCGA 48-8-6, which limits the percentage of local sales tax a jurisdiction may levy. And it also creates new local option sales tax contingent upon jurisdiction having a base year value homestead exemption. Revised local sales tax limitations. So the legislation revises the existing 2% local sales tax cap. Exemptions now include our E-SPLOS and up to 1% of the transportation sales tax, which include regional T-SPLOS, single county T-SPLOS, transit SPLOS, and model. One of the specialty pennies, including the new sales tax for property tax relief, was created by House Bill 581. Columbus, Muskogee, and Macon-Ville have local option sales tax. And Augusta Richmond County Coliseum has, of course, our special purpose local option sales tax. Most for Atlanta and cities connected to its water system, East Point, College Park, and Hickville. So what is the new sales tax? A new sales tax is created for the limited purpose of property tax relief. It may be levied in 0.05% increments up to 1%. So to be eligible to levy the tax, the county must have in effect a floating homestead exemption. It does not tax collected and distributed. Collection of the tax will begin at the start of the new calendar quarter, beginning more than 50 days after that date, as opposed to the 80 days for other local sales tax. And the Georgia Department of Revenue will send the money actually to the county. And how can this tax be renewed? This tax actually can run up to 5 years. So prior to the expiration, if the local governments want to renew this tax, you have to pass a local act calling for the reimposition of the tax and a new referendum to approve the tax, again, by our voters. How are funds from the new sales tax going to be used? Funds must be used exclusively for property tax relief. So we cannot use those funds for anything other than our property tax relief. Each taxpayer's property tax bill should state the amount by which property tax has been reduced because of the imposition of this tax. The rollback rate shall be reduced annually by the millage equivalent of the net proceeds of this new tax received by the political division during the prior taxable year. And if any political subdivision is not in compliance with the use of the proceeds from this tax, then the State Revenue Commissioner shall not certify the tax digest of that political subdivision. Financial impact for Augusta, I think Tim has already talked about it, but what you need to understand is that it's less stable than our property tax because it has to be approved by the referendums every 5 years. So I remind you, every 5 years this would have to be voted on. Now I'm going to turn it over to our tax assessor so that he can talk about the procedural process of this. Scott?
All right, so as part of 581 were some structural or procedural changes as it relates to the assessment process that will happen. The floating homestead and the related laws require opting out or just staying in, but all these other provisions are actually going to be in place next year. So you're familiar with our annual notice of assessment, which traditionally has shown all the millage rates and the estimated tax based on the prior year millage rate and the current value. That will no longer be on the notices of assessment. There will not be any tax amount shown on there. There will have to be an estimate, though, of what the rollback rate would be in the given year. And this is not the same rollback rate as the one that's required by the taxpayer bill of rights that we use in calculating our annual millage rate. But it is going to be structurally kind of the same. But we'll have to estimate whatever our rollback rate could be and put it on our annual assessment notice when we mail them out, which has been around June of every year the last few years. And we'll be required on that notice, again, replacing that prior year millage rate and estimated tax. And this was a kind of attempt to allow one, less confusion about what your upcoming tax bill would be because the rates hadn't actually been picked yet. So they're trying to pull back the tax-related issues on the notice of assessment. And there is some flexibility to how we create or estimate that rollback rate. So it's a requirement that the county certifies this rate to the tax commissioner prior to notices going out, and the tax commissioner will then share with us what that rate was that's been selected. And again, it does not have to be the same rollback rate as what will be coming up when we determine the digest millage rate, but it hopefully should be close. And if that rate actually exceeds what we estimated, there will have to be a statement on the tax bill to that effect that the actual rate, and I have to list the actual levying authority, exceeded the estimated rollback on the bill. So one provision that was removed from the tax assessment laws was that the sales price has to be the maximum allowable fair market value in the next taxable year. So for example, if our assessment is $200,000 and you acquire the property for $180,000, that next year you get your sales price as a taxable value. So that provision is going away and will no longer be applied to the property's value. And it alters and changes the way we have our annual ratio studies with the switched from looking back at our assessments to see how we were doing and started looking forward instead, and the methodology was kind of switched in time. So now they'll be going back to that old methodology, which they hope will improve statewide ratio studies, which have been declining for the last 3 or 4 years. Thankfully, ours were perfect last time. So we'll continue to do our job of valuing, but we'll just be audited by the Department of Audits a slightly different way. You may recall last year we did appeal our ratio study, but we came to the Board of Commissioners to request permission to do so. They've added the Board of Assessors as an appealing party to the ratio study, so we can now appeal directly as Board of Assessors to the Department of Audits and Accounts. All right, so every year we go through this appeals process with property owners who are unhappy with or disagree with our evaluations. If they get to a hearing body in the Board of Equalization or Superior Court or the hearing officer, that value that's determined by that hearing body establishes that value for the property owner for 3 years, the year of the appeal and the 2 subsequent years. They've modified that a little bit so that the only way you lock your value in as a property owner for appeal is if the value is reduced. So if it stays the same or in rare cases goes up, that value will not be locked in next to tax levels. So there's not as big of an issue in Richmond County, but in other counties there's a lot of Superior Court appeals where the property owners or tax representatives are not acting in good faith, not attending settlement conferences, and just using it to their advantage to maintain a lower tax bill while that property is still under appeal. So there's a provision in this law change that requires that the taxpayer act in good faith and respond to all required meetings and hearings. Otherwise, they don't get their reduced tax while the property is under appeal, and they could not redeem any lawyer fees at the end of that. So, and also for the first time in Georgia taxation history, they've actually set a time frame for how frequently the chief appraiser must revalue properties. The prior law is actually a rules and regs that just says we must visit properties at least every 3 years. Now it's in the actual code section that we have to revalue every parcel at least every 3 years. All right, so that jumps into some policy considerations. You want to take it over from there?
All right, so some policy considerations that this governing body will have to consider. One being that the floating homestead exemption benefits homeowners. That's what it's really targeted for in its simplest state, especially those that reside in the community for a long period of time. The taxes do not disappear, they only shift. So it's going to give the homeowners some relief, but it's going to shift a lot of the tax burden onto the commercial and the small businesses. And I know that's one of the things that our chambers are concerned about, as well as some of our governing body members who have talked about how the small businesses are going to be affected by this. The homestead exemption slows the growth in value for residential homestead properties, so it will create some upward pressure on the millage rate. And as you all know, we have a cap on our millage rate. The effects of a floating homestead increase over time will have a smaller impact in the early years and a larger impact in the later years. And each local government may independently decide whether to opt out. So let me also state that even if we do decide to opt in, stay in, or opt out, you do not have to approve any respective sales tax that we were talking about earlier. That's just an option that some agencies and some communities are doing to kind of take in that gap. Even if we decide again to opt out, nothing precludes our local delegation from passing. And I mentioned that earlier, that they can actually pass it for us, them do it. If we do decide to opt out, it may be best practice to make sure that we explain this decision to the public and our local delegation. Imposing the flexible local option sales tax would require, again, a referendum, as would renewing it in every 5 years. So the questions that we, again, have to make as a governing body is, does Augusta want to opt in or opt out of the floating homestead exemption, House Bill 581? And if we do decide to opt in, do we want to pursue the flexible local option sales tax to our property tax, which again will require a referendum every 5 years. So we have it currently on our agenda for January the 7th. So I'm glad our commissioner-elects are in the room, because that will be a discussion that we will be having. Again, if you choose to opt in, there's no further action that will be needed. But if you choose to opt out, we will have to schedule those 3 required public hearings. Before we do any questions, again, I want to thank our tax commissioner's office, our tax assessor's office, and our finance department for helping us put all this information together. I know it's a lot of information that we have provided to you today, but basically, to simplify it, it's been created to kind of take care more of the homeowners and put a lot more of the burden, I hate to say it, but the tax burden on the actual commercial and the small businesses. So those are the things that we have to consider. And I'll open it up to any questions, and I thank everybody who gives some present today. Thank you guys for coming up. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation on the details. My question is, if we were to opt in, the referendum on the ballot, when do you envision that would be?
I think we can do that at any time. Didn't we look at that, Tim, as far as if
Do it in
you're talking
November.
about the flexible
Yeah.
low option sales tax?
Yeah. Would you do that in November?
I believe so, yes.
And you'd have a SLOSS in November?
Yes, sir.
That's a kiss of death. Okay, so thank you for the presentation. I think it's pretty self-explanatory when you look at how 31 and verse 62, and the 62 would basically take the burden, to put the burden on that 62% people. And only 31 would see the reaps the benefits of it. If I was voting, I'd vote opt out, that's for sure. My question to you is, have you seen any other municipalities around here? Have they made any decisions? School board, anybody made any decisions already?
So, if they're doing the procedure correctly, they haven't.
Okay.
Because we're
But that's the
not
talk.
supposed to be any actual, decision making until January 1. But I think Columbia County School Board voted to opt out already.
Wow.
So hopefully that doesn't get them in any procedural trouble. But the discussion at, a seminar we had on this was that the majority, if not all, school boards will probably be opting out. One of their, I guess, big concerns is the upward pressure that this creates on the millage rate, and they're already capped at 20.
Yeah.
We have a dissimilar, but also a cap on our local millage rate, so that's another potential impact down the road, is continuing to increase pressure on that cap.
Yeah, I would just hate to see the commercial side of the commercial business and the significant tax increase. And we saw the chart, which is really good.
Has there been any models to kind of show how it would impact the commercial and industrial business and those taxes regarding?
So the impact would be, whatever the standard rate would have been for a rollback, if you're taking the float and put it in place, that will increase whatever that rollback could have been. So that gap between what the rollback is without the float and what it could be with it in place, that's really the impact. So I think the impact in 23 to 24 would have been, what did we determine, about $500,000 to $600 million in shift just for that 1 year. It would shift to all of the properties. And emphasizing this, a benefit potentially to homestead property, but because it's tied to a CPI, you really only benefit if your property is growing higher than whatever that rate is. So if there are properties that are stable, or properties that are growing less than that CPI, or even lowering value, they won't get any real benefit from the floating homestead. So the beneficiaries aren't going to be all 30,000 homesteads, it's going to be how many of them are above that annual cap.
Any additional questions?
Mr. Adams, I have one. So, you said that the local delegation, if we choose to opt out, could turn around and, so have we started that conversation? I mean, I know we don't meet with them until the 8th of January.
Yes, sir.
So do we have any early indications of how they stand, where they stand, one way or the other?
Not at this time, we don't. of our guests have any questions? Again, I know that was a lot of detail, but it just, it's really gonna be dependent upon how you're gonna proceed and, I guess the inequities that, you know, from 30-something% of our homeowners to 60-something% or what have you of our businesses are gonna be affected by this, so. I know a lot of, different organizations that I've been in contact with have decided to stay in, of course, but some of them have different sales tax in their respective community that supersedes pretty much what they're doing. So it's different for each municipality, depending on what they have in place. If there are no any other questions, Tax Commissioner's Office, did we miss anything? Okay. Mr. Roundtree, did we miss anything, tax assessors? All right. Nothing else we needed to share? And also want to thank ACCG and Scott for getting this information from ACCG and GMA that was presented to them when this discussion first started. So I appreciate that. All
I
right.
have a question.
Okay.
Are you gonna consider the opt-out and the loss at the same time?
That would be a question, that's a good question. But that's a question for how this governing body wants to proceed. I know Commissioner Franklin just mentioned, if we're doing it at the same time when we're doing our SPLOS, may not be a good time. So that would have to be a decision that you guys would have to consider.
I'm sorry, the loss, will we have to do that, if we opt in or we opt out? Or is that gotta be done anyway?
You don't know. It's not dependent upon if you opt in or opt out. You don't have to do that, period.
That's gonna happen anyway?
No, ma'am. You don't have to even do it.
Oh, you
If you don't want to. You don't have to do the flexible low option sales tax.
It does require, you have to have this base year floating homestead in place to even be able to consider the cost. So if the county opts out, then it wouldn't even be an option.
Okay.
If you allow the homestead to go through, you're not required to do the floss, nor is there a time limit on when you can do it in the future. Go with the homestead and wait until 26 or 27, whenever the commission determines to pursue it.
Hey,
Yes.
So, loss, which considers the property tax, so currently we have property tax relief for Kenny County. And so that needs to be explained as well. Our 8 cents that we collect, 4 of them are already in Richmond County, and 1 of them is already for property tax relief. That's already reflected on your tax bill today. So property tax relief through sales tax already is in Richmond County. Every county doesn't do that, but we have that. This would be in addition to that. And so if we decide to do that, that marketing that we already do that for taxpayers is important to know if we decide to take that up as well.
Very valid point. Thank you.
And it asked a question, it said something about a Coliseum penny. I was trying to figure out what that is. You saw that, ACCG?
It's the C's plus.
Yes.
The half cent to the,
Perhaps.
half cent to the Coliseum.
So listen, I know it's a work session, and I'm the new kid on the block, so help me understand if, I know we're saying it's a work session, is this one of many that we're gonna lead up to the discussion, or?
Well, we have to make a decision by March, and I just wanted to go ahead, we had the tax commissioner and the tax assessor had already presented some information at one of our commission meetings, or well, maybe our committee meeting
That was before the,
before it actually got voted on.
it was during the time, it was really, we had already started early voting.
Right.
And when I saw it, I met, with Commissioner, Tax Commissioner, and he said that, they needed to get on the calendar, to at least, tell the commission, inform the commissioners what was coming down the line. And I met with
follow-on meetings, because, I mean, I'm curious to know what our staff's recommendations are. And if we've received that already, I don't know if you all have received that or what, but I'd be curious to hear it. I mean, we got our experts here. What are the recommendations?
Oh, I
You haven't heard it?
You won't like, I guess you won't like it, but the board of assessors does not have an official meeting. We'll provide any individual or commission-wide education and information with questions you have to help you guide your opinion.
Okay.
Mr. Clerk, also the issue
We
is
were
that
talking about the decision window, March. If we wait till March, it's gonna put extreme pressure on the tax commission assessors office. We have to reprogram it. The school board is out, it's looking like they'll opt out. So we're gonna have a bill that's going to present now one valuation for them, and then a whole different valuation for us. We are a part of a conglomerate of a group that uses Tyler's system, and we're one of the few that is gonna have to be reprogrammed in order to do that. So the March window bumps right up against the Homestead Exemption window, and all that goes with it. And so in January, they helps us program so that we can get the bills out on time. That program, as you remember, when we switched over last time, I worked with IT and all that goes in there. It's just a lot to do. So I hope we can look for March.
Okay.
Mr. Clerk, just as a practical matter, you're going to have to make a decision by the second meeting in January for the calendar issues and publication issues and the climate issues, storms, things of that nature, holiday issues, because there's not if we had an ice storm, so to speak, we're not going to be delayed to be able to do it. So it's not like we have 90 days, we really have 60 days. All of that happened. So really, by the second meeting in January, we have to decide.
And that includes the 3 public notifications that have to go on during that time, has to occur.
It would have to
in
occur
60
during,
days.
it would have to occur during March, during February. So the earlier in January you do, the better off we are.
If the governing body determines to opt out.
Correct.
And I think it's a basic question of equity. I mean, do you want your homeowners to have more relief and your businesses to experience, additional taxes?